Hi guys, it's another video lecture. This will be the last set for this chapter, and the plan is that we'll finish up the chapter today, and then I'll Skype in at the end of these videos and we'll get a chance to discuss any questions you may have about the chapter, just review a few things, and then you should be ready for the quiz tomorrow. So go ahead and get out your notebook if you haven't already done so. Get out a pen or a pencil, whatever you use to write your notes down with, and we'll go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with talking about the depths of the Depression. We're in the 1930s right now in the chapter, and hunger is one of the main problems because there are lots of people who are unemployed, and since they're not employed, they can't buy food. And since they can't buy food for themselves or their families, they're hungry. So there were a lot of private charities, rescue missions, soup kitchens that initially tried to keep up with the demand for food. But it was very difficult to do. Your book talks about the bread lines, and that's what they literally were. They were lines essentially for food. They would be handed bread or other types of food. And people during the heights of the Depression, in urban areas specifically, would wait in line, and the lines would often stretch at least a city block or longer of people waiting in line to get bread or some kind of food, soup, anything that they could eat to keep them going. The problem was, though, that a lot of these rescue missions just couldn't keep up with the demand. They just didn't have enough private funding because, again, the Depression hit everybody, so even the people that were donating just didn't have as much to donate. Kind of like during the 2008 market crash, a lot of food banks suffered. There were news articles about how donations to food banks and homeless shelters were down significantly because of the recession. So this is the same thing that's going on during the Great Depression, where there's not enough money keeping these soup kitchens going. So the local and state agencies, like the state government and the local governments, would try to donate to these bread lines or start their own form of relief in the form of a bread line. And the federal government would try to kick in as well, give some money, but they already have all these other agencies, like we talked about, the CCC, WPA, TVA, etc., etc., etc. So they don't have a lot of money to go around, and the local agencies that, like whatever soup kitchen or whatever homeless shelter is giving money for these people to have food and shelter, it's really not anything that's enough to keep them alive. Some families would get $5 a week. In New York City, where there was a lot of homelessness and joblessness, it was under $3 a week in aid these people would receive. Another problem these people struggled with is they're hungry, but they're also humiliated. They feel ashamed of not having employment. A lot of people blamed themselves and felt like they just weren't looking for a job hard enough, or there must be something that they were doing wrong. When in reality, there were hundreds of thousands of people in the same situation as them. Your book gives an example of people that wrote to President Roosevelt saying, "We need help, listen to our story, but please don't tell anyone else about it because we're ashamed." So the people that were struggling, they were hungry, which is one point in your notes about the Depression. They were also humiliated. So a third thing is homelessness was a large problem because people didn't have money to pay rent, and if you don't have money to pay rent or pay your mortgage, you get kicked out. Now, for people who owned their homes free and clear, they were at least able to keep those. But some people that had their homes free and clear even had trouble paying utilities. But the hobo, like the person who would sleep out outside basically, and would this is the legend of the hobo. You know, you see the cartoons back in the day of the guy with the stick over his shoulder and a bundle tied to it, and he would hop a train and just sleep where he felt like and jump off the train whenever he felt like. It comes from this time period here, where there were so many people that they just were homeless that they would start essentially jumping trains trying to get somewhere better, but oftentimes there was nowhere better to go. So anyway, the three things that are really a big deal in the 1930s, it's hunger, humiliation, and homelessness. The next thing that we're going to talk about is the Dust Bowl. So if you're doing headings, subheadings, this would be a subheading. The Dust Bowl. Now, many of you may already know what the Dust Bowl is. You may remember it from 8th grade U.S. history. Some of you may be hearing this for the first time, but I think the Dust Bowl is probably the most tragic incident that occurs in the whole Great Depression. To understand the Dust Bowl, though, we have to go back in time a little bit to the very early 1900s. Where we just got done covering in the chapter was the mid-1930s. So let's go back to 1900. And in 1900, at the turn of the century, people started moving out westward to the Midwest. They started moving to places like Kansas, North Texas, Colorado, New Mexico. And these areas that they moved to a lot of times were just vast prairie land. So it's just pretty much grass as far as the eye can see. There's actually a movie made about the Dust Bowl called Sea of Grass. And that was what the term they used to describe the prairie land out west before people moved there. It was just a vast sea or an ocean of grass. When the people started moving out west to these prairie lands, they weren't content to just let them be what they were. What they probably would have been best used for is grazing livestock. And yes, some people did graze livestock in North Texas and in Kansas and in Oklahoma, another region that's a vast prairie land. But what a lot of people did that moved out here was they plowed under the grass and they started planting crops. Now, this starts expanding as far as the movement to till under the grassland and plant crops throughout the early 1900s into the 1920s, where it starts to reach its peak before the Depression, where basically instead of grass as far as you could see, there were crops pretty much as far as you could see in a lot of areas where people had plowed under fields and they started planting things like wheat. And they started producing a lot of food. The production of produce in America increased greatly due to the farming out here in the Midwest. However, when the Great Depression happens, the farmers out there are hit almost with like a 1-2 punch. So what happens first is the Great Depression hits and food prices just plummet. People just aren't able to pay what they could before for food, and there are other market factors that just drive the price down of food. So it actually ends up being more expensive a lot of times for these farmers to produce food than what they're getting paid to produce it. Another thing happens at the same exact time, and it's a massive drought. The Dust Bowl really occurs because the people plowed all this grassland under, and they started planting crops. Well, I don't know if any of you have ever worked in a garden, and you've ever tilled on a windy day, but if you till the garden soil under on a windy day and the soil's dry, you can actually see if the wind happens to catch the soil, you can see it take little bits of it away. Well, in the Dust Bowl, people had nothing to really plant because if you planted the seeds, nothing grew because there's no water. It was pretty much a continual drought for 4 years in most of these areas. So it was just, instead of grassland, it was just dirt land now because they had plowed it under and had nothing to plant. And so the wind would be moving across just like it had been before, but since there was literally no moisture in the topsoil, it would just take the topsoil with it and blow it, almost like a snowdrift. But they literally, in the Great Plains during the Dust Bowl, they had dirt drifts. So if your house wasn't airtight, you would actually have dirt blown through the cracks in your house, inside your house, to the point where people would actually, inside their homes, put a wet cloth across their face to keep from inhaling all the dust. There are pictures, if you want to Google it, of homes on these farmsteads that on one side it's just open, and on the other side there's this giant pile of dirt that was blown there by the wind. And it made it impossible for people to farm anymore during this time period because there's no water, and even if they had water, all their topsoil got blown away. So people in the Dust Bowl region, largely Oklahoma, this is like the center of the Dust Bowl, but it also hits North Texas, parts of New Mexico and Colorado as well, and Kansas. But a lot of them just picked up and left because they can't even feed themselves there, let alone anyone else. So they just packed up everything they could in a truck or a car, and they drove out to California trying to get a job out west. And they figured, at least if they're not going to find work out in California, they won't have to wear a rag over their face to keep from being choked by the dirt, or they won't have to worry about their front door being buried by a dirt drift. So a lot of people fled the Midwest because of the Dust Bowl. And even after the Dust Bowl was over and it rained again, farming methods changed drastically in the Dust Bowl region. People tried to conserve the soil more. They tried to use it for pasture land again instead of tilling under the dirt. They replanted grass and hay and tried to leave it alone so that the soil didn't erode anymore. But this was basically a time of despair for everyone in the Midwest, because not only had the economy crashed, then the food prices crashed, and then all their farm soil got swept away, and they had a hard time eating, and they had a hard time even breathing out there. It was just terrible. If you're ever interested, you can Google some good documentaries. There are some documentaries on the Dust Bowl on YouTube as well, but a very tragic time period in the Great Depression.